The link, I think, will be posted after this lecture by the TAs. Nope, no tutorials. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Intro to Movement Neuroscience. I hope that you all missed me, because then we'd be missing each other. So we had some questions about the tutorial Google Meets link. Remember, there's no tutorial this week. The tutorial for, I think that's scheduled for February 2nd, all virtual, but that is in the module 2 section because that's the material it's pertaining to. I think the TAs will be posting the Google Meets link after this lecture, just so that way you guys know where to connect, so that way you can log in and then watch the PowerPoint presentation and ask any questions to the TAs. Before we get started, I just wanted to confirm that everyone did okay with sort of the formatting of the course. Was everyone able to to log into the online quiz and complete it? Awesome. So like Talasi was saying earlier, she found it very interactive. That's sort of the point. It's a interactive way to sort of engage you guys into the material, sort of intro you to the material of the lecture, and then I can sort of carry on from that slide. Awesome. I'm glad. It was a little touch and go there when we all got locked out for a little bit, but I just emailed the appropriate people and sort of got it all sort of worked out. And so I think we should be good now, knock on wood. Thanks, Aaron. Technology is the future. I think it's confusing, but we should, it's available to us, so we should optimize, especially as it pertains to sort of learning. So before we get started with the material, remember that the online lecture part is basically the intro to the material of the synchronous lecture. So on the online portion, or the asynchronous portion, we went through these slides here already. So we went through here, and we were introduced to all of these topics, and then we finished off here. Now, before we get started with the new material, is there any questions about the stuff that was in the online lecture? Well, Eric's going ahead. Okay, so Eric's going to teach the course today. I heard Eric is a really tough prof, but he does it because he really wants you all to learn. I respect it. Yeah, he definitely does take bribes. Okay, Mustin had a question. I'm not sure if the question was answered, but yes. Did you see the embedded quiz on the online lecture where like you would stop and then you have to answer a question and then you just continued on? Hi, Karen. Okay, awesome. So no questions about the material? Okay, Talasi has a question about a potential question on the midterm. Go. Yep.
Hi, Professor. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, so pardon?
I think everyone can hear you, right?
Oh, okay. On the online quiz, there was one of the questions that asked about the position, whether it was anterior or posterior to the frontal lobe or the parietal lobe. And I was wondering if in the midterm we would be given questions, or we are required to memorize like the positions of them.
Yeah, I think so. The ones that were presented, because we'll go over it today, like it's just knowing that the main landmarks in the brain are the central sulcus and the longitudinal fissure. And so knowing that anterior to the central sulcus is the frontal lobe is important because that's a motor. And then posterior or behind the central sulcus is the sensory area. So if you look on this diagram right here, so the anterior is forward, posterior is back. This central sulcus is what demarcates the motor from sensory region.
So we wouldn't be given just a picture of the brain and then asked to label. Like we would be given some sort of direction as to anterior, posterior to the frontal lobe, or like some sort of hint like that.
Kind of, yeah. There will be diagrams on the midterm that you will have to sort of label the things that we've talked about in lecture, but it'll be ones that we've talked about a lot.
Okay, thank you so much.
Like, yeah, so like, for example, like you'll be asked to label like what, so if you got this diagram here, and then it would have like an arrow to right here, you would have to know that it's the primary motor cortex. So Hannah's asking, like, yeah, so like the lobes would be a big one because then we talked about them in the online lecture, and then the motor planning areas, sort of big things. You can see that if things are going to be tested because it's like repeated over and over. Does that make sense, Flossie? I think you're off your mic.
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Yep. Okay. Okay. So Joseph, I'll get to you guys, or I'll get to you after sort of the lecture, because we haven't talked about the motor homunculus part just yet. So then I'll answer the question when we get to that part, if that's cool. Just ask the question again. Awesome. So in the online portion, we learned about sort of the general anatomy of the brain and how you can sort of landmark it by using the sulci and gyri. We noticed, or we learned, that the different lobes are important for specific aspects of control. This course is specifically looking at the brain anatomy and using that to understand how we control movement. So it's an Intro to Movement Neuroscience course. And when we're talking about our ability to voluntarily control our bodies and react with the environment in the way that we see fit, we're going to be talking about using our motor planning areas. The ability to move or consciously voluntarily move our bodies is sort of organized from a top-down method. And so what happens is that in our brain, we have our motor planning areas that are going to decide or figure out what muscles we have to contract in order to achieve the goal that we've decided we wanted to do. And then that is created or converted into action potentials that will go down the spinal cord, into the peripheral nerves, and into the muscles to ultimately contract them. So we have the decision to move our body occurring in the frontal lobe. And then from that, we have our 3 motor planning areas that we're going to learn about that take that thought and convert it into what muscles do I need to contract at which times to complete this motion. The 3 motor planning areas that we're going to learn about today are the primary motor cortex, the premotor cortex, and the supplementary motor cortex. And they all work together to, like I said, we're creating a list of the different nerves that we need to activate so we can contract the specific muscles required in whatever movement we've decided that we wanted to do. Remember, we make a decision to move in our frontal lobe, and then that activity moves through the motor planning areas, down the spinal cord, out through the peripheral nerves into the muscles. And so if we look at it through this flow diagram, this is how the decision to move gets converted into the activation of different nerves or neurons, and then it ultimately leads to muscle contraction. Does that make sense, everyone? Awesome. Hopefully you're all excited. So let's first start and talk about Oh, why is it specifically initiated in the precentral cortex? There's different reasons why we can activate our muscles, but we're talking about voluntary control, and that comes from the decision made in the frontal lobe. Yep, this is being recorded. So let's first talk about the primary motor cortex. The primary motor cortex, as its name suggests, is sort of the most important motor planning area. And because it is the final pathway that is involved in the initiation, coordination, and voluntary movements for fine motor control. It is located, and this is a question that Talassi asked. It is, hopefully I'm saying that right. This is located anterior to the central sulcus. So that's why it's called the precentral gyrus. It is the gyrus, which is the fold, located just anterior to the central sulcus. And I don't know how much you guys learned in anatomy or A and P, but with muscles, you landmark muscles based on origin and insertion. Your brain is sort of movable, and so you can't do it that way. The way that they do it is by landmarking through the different folds and lines. Those are consistent throughout individuals' brains, so that's consistent through all brains, and so that's why they use it to landmark. Yep, that's exactly it, Eric. And that's why it's so important to this course. We're going to say central sulcus about 15 times a lecture, probably more, for the duration of the course. To be a great drinking game. If you drink. Cheers. Okay, so that's why the central sulcus is so important, because here would be the central sulcus, and then we have our 3 motor planning areas that we're learning directly in front of it. The first one is the primary motor cortex, and it is the pathway that is involved in activating individually all of our muscles for fine control. It's organized into what's called a motor homunculus. And so this is a graphical representation of the motor homunculus, but this is a graphical representation of the part of the homunculus or the part of the primary cortex that's associated with that particular part of the body. So Joseph, yes, you were right in saying that. What would you say is the reason that we have a greater representation for the hand and the face than we do for, let's say, the lower body? Yeah, so everyone's right. So for Joseph, what I would say is that if you imagine that like the cell bodies of all of our neurons are in the gray matter, there's a larger representation, therefore meaning more neurons that go to the hand and the face. So if we think of, like a little marionette puppet, the more strings that you have on a puppet, the more movements you can create, or the more movements of the joints, because there's more control. We have the most control of, or most fine control of, our hands and our face. So therefore, we have a bigger representation of those areas on our primary motor cortex. And has a question and answer, yep. So we're all correct, that's awesome. We're all totally getting it. Cortical area means gray matter. So cortex is gray matter. So see how there's more gray matter, there's just more cortex, more brain associated with that area. Why do you guys think that having a large representation for the face is important? Sidebar. Yeah, body language. So of our communication, 70% of our communication between people, and well, I guess with anything, is nonverbal. And so we evolved from animals. Animals don't typically talk unless you have a parrot, which I do. But most of animals, they communicate through facial expressions. And so we evolved that way as well. And so there's a difference between seeing, like, I'm excited to see you guys, versus I'm excited to see you guys. You can tell a lot by the expressions on someone's face. So we need significant control of that. Oops. So you guys were all right with this talking about the motor homunculus. Thanks for all being engaging. And what would happen if we damage this part of the brain? So we're going to find out that a lot of the studies that they looked at, or figured out what parts of the brain are important for what is because they did like sort of studies on monkeys, which is sad. But that's how a lot of the early research before like animal ethics was greater. But this is where a lot of that initial research came from. If this part of the area is damaged, so if there is a damage to the primary motor cortex, that could happen through any type of lesion, through a stroke or a stab wound or an aneurysm, anything, concussion. But if that area of the brain is damaged, we're going to have a loss of fine control of whatever part of the motor homunculus that lesion or that injury is located. Now, one thing that I wanted you guys to know is, remember how we talked about, I think in the online lecture, that the left cerebrum controls the right side of the body and vice versa. So if we were to get a lesion in the left primary motor cortex, it's going to affect the right side of the body. Yep, everyone's right. Contralateral means like opposite side, yeah. Yeah, exactly, AKA stroke patients. But this is what happens. So now you have a better clinical understanding of like what would happen with stroke patients and they can't control. It's because they've damaged part of the primary motor cortex. We'll get there. And so it's not actually a cortex at all. It's not a homunculus at all for those areas. Joseph is asking if the different motor planning areas have a homunculus as well. And they're not organized into homunculus. Here we have sort of a research protocol that we do at the labs in Ontario Tech. And that's why I just bring up this slide. This is called transcranial magnetic stimulation. I don't know if you can see in the slides, but there's the participants or the researchers holding a wand. And that allows sort of like the shooting of or discharge of the magnetic potential, and that disrupts part of the brain. So rather than surgically altering or affecting someone's brain, you could work on humans by doing this magnet technique, and then it doesn't hurt anybody. It's just a way to temporarily disrupt and see what the effect is, and then you can infer what part of the brain is useful for what based on those findings. What's FMA? Ah, okay. I am older than you guys, so I was like a Neon Genesis guy. So the next area is called the premotor area. So remember, we have three main motor planning areas. These are the areas that are going to plan out which muscles to contract for coordinated movement. The premotor area is located anteriorly and inferiorly to the primary motor cortex. You can see it right there. So that would be the premotor area. And what the premotor area does is that it activates our core muscles, our core and posture muscles, before the initiation of movement. So if I want to, lift and pick up this cup, what do you think is the first muscles that need to be contracted? Yeah, core and posture muscles. We need to tighten up our body so that way when I reach over to grab the cup, I don't fall over. So the fine control is in my hand and my arms, whereas the core muscles are contracted to stabilize my body so I can complete that fine control. This is what the premotor area does. What it does is it looks at the moment or the movements that you want to perform and then activates the associated core muscles to keep us stable. That's what's called the premotor area. You're activating your core prior to movement. And so that's why it's typically involved with the trunk and girdle muscles, because those are our posture muscles. When we, you guys are ever walking on ice because it's slippery outside, and then you go to start slipping and your body already adjusts to stabilize. That's your premotor area that does that as well, because it's in control of the core muscles. The other thing that was interesting, you can see this in a YouTube video that I posted just below. The premotor area is also the area of the brain that's involved with perceiving motion. So if I wanted to learn a new skill and I could watch someone do it and then do it myself, the premotor area is involved in doing that. And so using monkey studies, what they found is that if this area of the brain is damaged, monkeys lost the ability, because I guess they weren't making them slip, they're all strapped in, and we're making them slip and checking their core muscle activations. What these monkeys did was they lost the ability to watch another monkey find food or figure out how to get the food from a dish or something, and then they lost the ability to mimic. Nope, so it's, Talasi, think of the premotor area as, once we've decided, it's looking at how we want to activate our core muscles for the motion that's about to perform. So it's not learning. The learning actually happens in the cerebellum. Monkey see, monkey cannot, monkey was hurt. Eric, if you could drink one for the monkey, that would be great. There you go. The next area is the supplementary motor area, and it is located right here. So above the premotor area, and it actually wraps around. So this is the inside surface, so you can see how it can sort of wraps around. The supplementary motor area is sort of involved and is essential for sequential movements and bimanual movements. Bimanual movements means movements that use both arms at once, and sequentially means, think of like a dance routine, movements in order. So think of it this way, that the first thing is that this area is going to communicate and coordinate motor planning when we're using two hands at once, like playing guitar, playing piano, but it's also going to be used in sequential movement, meaning like if I'm going to play a piano routine, I have to, so let's say you're playing a piano routine and there's a high note coming up. So technically you have to move your hand to ahead of time to be aware of or be able to hit that high note. And it sort of all happens automatically. Your supplementary motor area is considering the movements that are going to be happening in the future, and then adjusts the activation of your muscles to incorporate what potentially could be happening in the future. Does that make sense? Okay, awesome. For sure, everyone. And like Karen said, like a tap dance stream, for sure. Because depending on, like, let's say if I am going to have to reach over here as my next movement, my body's already primed for that. That's everything sort of integrating together. So if we all get it, that's awesome. And then one more for the monkeys. The way that they figured out that this doesn't, that this involves movement with both hands is that what they did was they strapped a monkey into a table, and to get the, their one arm could reach food, and there was a hole in the table. And then the other arm that was under the table could only reach their mouth. So they had to learn to take food, drop it through a hole, grab it, and then put it in their mouth. And so when they sort of disrupted this area on the monkey, it was unable to do that. Janet, questions? So this is why individuals with impairments in this region will present with jerky or unsmooth movements. Actually, no. So the jerky and unsmooth movements is a different area of the brain that we'll get to midway through this lecture. And Hannah is saying, so it anticipates change in movement. So no, the premotor cortex is sort of what is, it's called anticipatory postural adjustments. It is adjusting our posture, whereas this area is, it's not anticipating because it is knowing what's coming ahead of time. Anticipating means you don't know, I would say, but like, so you're technically right, but I would consider it more that it knows what's coming up. So it's adjusting your motor activation based on what is the next in sequence? What is the next movement in sequence? No, muscle memory is going to be the cerebellum. So I love that you guys are asking all questions that are leading me into the next slide. Which one? Arvin is asking for an example of. Yeah, so William gave an analogy. Think of it like sequential movements as completing a task step by step. So the supplementary motor area knows what step is coming next. So you're completing step 1, whereas the supplementary motor area already knows what step 2 is. So it's like going to all sort of blend into each other. Awesome. So Mason's asking if this part of the brain would be used when you rehearse a lot. It definitely would be, because you are imagining yourself. You're imagining yourself or watching yourself performing the movement. Our muscle memory is actually happening through our cerebellum, though. Think of the motor planning areas, and they're always going to be involved, but the motor planning areas are happening in real time. So that processing is happening in real time. The memory part happens in the cerebellum for motor skills. This is the primary somatosensory area. So when we were talking about the central sulcus, posterior to the central sulcus is the primary somatosensory area. It's going to be organized into a sensory homunculus. So here we have the graphical representation here. And it's going to be responsible for discriminative touch. So it's going to be responsible for our ability to tactilely discriminate what we're getting, our sensation of touch, pressure, proprioception, vibration, pain, and temperature. Pain and temperature can be perceived in different parts of the brain. So it's not completely localized to just the primary somatosensory area, but the primary somatosensory area is responsible for our senses that we're able to localize. So when I close my eyes and someone touches me in the shoulder, I know that I've been touched there. If I close my eyes and someone moves my finger, I'll know the position and what's moving. I can localize where the senses are coming from. It's the primary somatosensory area that's doing that. So if we're looking at this homunculus, Joseph, because you've been talking about the homunculus a lot, what do you notice is a bit different in this homunculus versus the motor one? Yeah, that's true. No, in the graphical representation. Lips are bigger, yep. It's also the tongue. Sense of taste. It is lateral side? Jung Bei, say that again. I'm not sure your question. It is lateral side. This would be lateral, yeah. Yes, this is lateral. This is medial. So like outside, inside. So that would be right here. And remember, yes, see right there? Because the sense of discriminate. Okay, so if you guys want to get real personal, speaking scientifically here, okay, let's all be mature. I'm talking to myself more than anyone. When you have an orgasm, is that an ability to localize where that's coming from? It's not discriminative touch. It is a feeling from like an overall feeling, different part of the brain. Does that make sense, Joseph? Joseph, you asked the question. No, you are. There's like all this. There is. I mean, maybe they did it a little bit less for the purposes of the textbook. There's still an area like you can still like look at the eye. You can still feel your eye. You can still feel it, but that wide-ranging sort of like feeling that it would cause is non-discriminative. It's also the sense also goes to different parts of the brain. The limbic system. It also releases different neurotransmitters. Yeah. That's okay? So remember, this is for discriminative touch. Yeah. Hopefully, so the idea is that nothing in itself is very difficult in this course per se. I'm trying to give you a general idea of how everything works, because then it'll like exactly what you're doing. It'll there'd be like an aha moment, like, this is why there's certain things. This is why it's this way. This is why things I've noticed. This is why it works this way. Karen, is this an exam question about this part? No, it is not. That's a life question. Yes. Yep. Lips can do that. We're just really growing as a group. So here we have the sensory homunculus again. And if we had a lesion, so a stroke or an injury to this part of the brain, you would lose the ability to feel discriminative touch in that, or discriminative sense in that part of the body. But remember, contralateral, it's the opposite side. Am I going too fast, everyone? Or are you guys okay? Sorry, is everyone okay? Awesome. You were all good as well. Thanks, Lena. Joseph asking a question. The cassate means crossing over. Like transferring sides. Latin. Yeah. That's why you see that word. The cassation means that's where it crosses over. Yep. The next part of the body, so we talked about the motor planning areas. So that was the motor specific area of our cortex or cerebrum. Now we're going to be talking about the basal ganglia. Latin, that means a collection of nuclei. Ganglia means like nucleus. It's a collection of different nuclei. It's located right here in the between the temporal lobe and the parietal lobe. So if you opened up the brain, you could see it right inside. And I had a question because left side effects, right? Yes, that's correct. And so what the basal ganglia is, there's one on each side. And like I said, it's a collection of nuclei that work together for a particular purpose. And it's located in the insular cortex. So it's deep in the cerebral hemispheres. And so I forget who asked, but we were talking about like jerky movements, preventing jerky movements. It's actually the basal ganglia that is responsible for that. So it's responsible for adjusting the activity of the muscles we've decided to contract and making sure it produces smooth movement. So it receives input from all those motor planning areas. As that signal gets sent back down, or gets sent down to the muscles, it adjusts the activity to make sure that it's smooth. And how do we know that? Because so what, does anyone know what Parkinson's disease is? Traditionally, yes, exactly. So traditionally, they figured out, so they would look at all these diseases and then figure out what they did, and then that's what gives us an idea of that part of the brain must do this. So people with Parkinson's disease have a bunch of symptoms, one of them being jerky movement. So then they were like, researchers were like, oh, okay, this part of the brain must be involved in that somehow. Because it can, so Eric is asking a question, how can some drugs like THC help with Parkinson's disease? Because it suppresses different areas of the brain. So in Parkinson's disease, some parts aren't working and some are overproductive. And we'll learn that in the Parkinson's disease lecture. but the parts that are working too much get suppressed. Yeah, antagonist. So here, okay, so let's say hypothetically we have the primary motor cortex right around here. Does that make sense? Or can we all picture that? All the neurons that are coming from the motor planning areas are going to come down through the brainstem into the spinal cord. So if you look at it, this is the basal ganglia color-coded in like purple or blue. It's in the perfect location because it's surrounding all of the fibers, or the projection fibers, that are going into the spinal cord. And so this is going to regulate the activity of the upper motor neurons that are going into the spinal cord to make sure that movement is smooth. This is the thalamus. And just so that you guys all know, I don't know if I said it in the online lecture, but the thalamus is like anything going in and out of the brain works through the thalamus. So it's like the relay center. Association tracts are those tracts that are on the same side of the brain. So association tracts would be how the frontal cortex talks to the motor planning areas, right? So they're all talking within each other on the same side of the brain. Commissural tracts transfer over. So the supplementary motor cortex would have commissural tracts that are going to the other side of the brain. And then the projection tracts are coming in and out of the brain. Arvin has a question. That's not a question, but can you put the PowerPoint in the presentation though, just to make it a bit bigger? The problem is that once I do that, I can't chat. Yeah, no, it's okay. It's a fair question. Projection tracts from the online lecture, Shane, they run in and out of the brain to the body. So projection tracts are projecting to the brain and from the brain out to the body. So all of those go in between the collection of nuclei, the basal ganglia, what's surrounding it. Think of like the wires coming in and out of the brain. The basal ganglia is like a donut around it. So it's a perfect way to sort of adjust the firing that's being sent down. Does that make sense, Shane? What did Eric say? Oh, nice. Yeah, you can do that. Okay, perfect. So you guys can see me in like 4K. Nice. You're welcome. Everyone okay? Not going too fast? Or am I going too fast? Perfect. Almost done the lecture. The next part of the brain is the cerebellum. Who asked about muscle memory? Talassi! You and Eric today, on fire. This part of the brain is responsible for muscle memory. So this is the cerebellum here. So let me give you like a little landmark. This would be the top of the brain. This would be your brain stem. This is the front. This is posterior or the back. This is the cerebellum. So it sits on the back end of your brainstem right here. It is also organized into white matter and gray matter. That's why the word cerebellum means, doesn't look like seafood, but it means little brain. What do you notice about the different folds in the cerebellum compared to the folds in the cerebrum? It's smaller. It's because it's much more foldy, it can compact more into smaller space. So actually more than 50% of the neurons in our body are located in this small area. Because it's folded so tightly, it can fit more in. It does look like, that's exactly what it looks like. Talassi. So it means Latin brain, just like our cerebrum is divided into two halves, left and right. Except in the middle, it's not a line, it's a midline vermis. Vermis is Latin for worm because it kind of looks like a worm. Oh, and that's why it's called the arbor, like the way it's structured is called the arbor vitae, because it means the tree of life. Side point, do you see how in the Latin and the anatomical words that they came up with, they were all just describing what they see. I know, but they sound so ridiculous. Like, wait till we get to the tracks, like learning of the tracks in the spinal cord. It's like the reticular formation and stuff. Sometimes French. Yep. Spell français. Moi aussi. There you go. We will now do the rest of the lecture in French. So the function of the cerebellum, we talked about muscle memory, it's involved in coordinated movement and postural control. So there's a part of the brain, or the part of the cerebellum down here, that's going to be involved in coordinating equilibrium and balance. So the part of the motor areas that it's connected to is would be the premotor area, right? Postural control. But most importantly, what the cerebellum is important for is learning the timing, the rhythm, and synchronization of movements. And so when we learn to coordinate ourselves, when we're doing motor skills, it's the cerebellum that is storing our muscle memory. That's good one, Jen. Okay, so let me explain what that means. So we talked about the basal ganglia and how there's the upper motor neurons coming in and out of, sounds bad, upper motor neurons that are coming in and out of the cerebrum. The basal ganglia is surrounding it and is able to sort of affect the force of the muscles that we are contracting. The cerebellum doesn't adjust force, but what it does is it times the order and the sort of like the pattern of how we activate our muscles. Because if we think of little kids that are learning to play soccer or anything, they're very uncoordinated. Their bodies are all over the place. And then as they learn, they become more fluid or efficient in their movements. That's because the cerebellum is learning the motor program. It's muscle memory. It's learning the right order and in which the timing of how to activate those muscles. So Eric's saying, so the cerebellum refers to the timing of the muscle contractions and the basal ganglia controls the intensity. 100% correct. So Joseph is asking, when you work out and focus on slow contractions, what part of the body is working? So when you're concentrating on something, think of it this way. So if you're concentrating, that part is mental. So that would be frontal lobe. And then you already have the stored program of whatever you've learned. You're consciously just slowing it down. Because so think of it like all of the things that we're learning today, all of these different areas, they're all working at the same time. But it's all what they do. Like think of like the parts of a car. To drive, they're all working, but they all do different sort of things. They're all working together. So if I have, let's go on with Joseph's example. So if I'm doing bench press, and I've been doing it for a long time, I have the muscle memory of like the order in which to activate my muscles to be able to do it efficiently, right? I'm not like moving all over the place, I got this. The movement is smooth because my basal ganglia is regulating the movement. But if all of a sudden I close my eyes and I want to decide to go real slower or do a negative really slow, I'm consciously affecting that. So conscious is the frontal lobe. Yeah, so exactly. So because the order's not changing, you're just doing it slower because you're deciding you want to do that. So when you learn a dance routine, let's say I want to like, right? If I want to do it slower, it's the same rhythm. So you've learned the order in which to activate your muscles. You're just consciously doing it slower. I'm a lot of things. I just like dancing. Is everyone okay with that? Is that good? Oh, let me just figure out, say one last thing. We're going to get into more detail about how the cerebellum works, but the reason why it has so much cortical area is because it integrates a lot of sensory information, non-conscious sensory information. And so we're going to learn about this in that lecture, but it is integrating all of our proprioception. So it's aware of how our body's moving in space, and then all of the muscles that we're contracting, it gets sent back from the spinal cord back up to the cerebellum. So it's coordinating, or it's evaluating what we wanted to do and how we move. And so it's always comparing, and then it will know when we adjust our timing if we were close to our goal, and then it remembers what was the right timing to have the best ability to do what we wanted to do. Well, you don't need to know that for the first midterm. We're going to get like super in depth into it in that lecture, sorry. But I just wanted to sort of update you guys. The next is the next area of the brain or central nervous system is the most evolutionarily oldest, the brainstem. So the cerebrum would be on top. This is looking at the brainstem from the back and the front. It's broken down into 3 different areas: the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla. And so obviously it's containing all of the sensory and motor neurons that are traveling up and down from the spinal cord to the brain. So it acts as like a conduit. It's involved in controlling equilibrium and head orientation through reflex centers that we'll talk about. It's the connection for the cerebellum. It is the emerging site for all of the cranial nerves. And in terms of the things that it does, it's because it's evolutionarily older, so all types of forms have brain stems. It is for like sort of regulatory vital functions, so like breathing rate, heart rate, body temperature, stuff like that. Yes, the brainstem is for homeostasis. So Hannah, no, there will be just those 7 questions for the review, like sample questions. But because you have the questions coming up on each of the online lectures, you then have like 40 questions to sort of work within what is the most important stuff. Because remember, this is really a lot of material, but we're only getting tested on the main things that gets repeated. Like, I think the experience of having the first midterm, you'll kind of pull it together like, oh, okay. It's complicated stuff, but we're being tested on the main material. And if you don't feel that way, you can always just like, we can talk about it in class and try to get a better idea of how to prepare you guys for the questions. None of the questions are made to, I'm not a prof that is trying to like screw anybody over. It's more really trying to pick the best questions to ensure that you guys are picking up what I want you guys to learn, what I feel is the most important to learn, and sort of guiding you. Yeah, the lecture questions are very similar. I made them all up. And I made the midterm. So. This is the brainstem here. So Joseph was talking about the inferior and superior colliculi, and you can see those right there. So this is the front, this is the back. What's this? Cerebellum, okay? So the cerebrum would be here. This is the midbrain. So it's basically the connection from the pons to the cerebrum. So it's basically peduncles. It's 2 stalks that are holding the cerebrums together. That's what it kind of looks like. But in terms of, remember, this course is about learning about movement. There's reflex centers, the superior and inferior colliculi, that are located on the back end of the midbrain. And why these are important is because the superior colliculi, when we, okay, so if we are standing there, and so what I used to do is I used to when we had in-person lectures way back in the old world. I used to have someone light a firecracker, which I don't know if that's allowed anymore. But your body, if something really bright flashes or a loud noise, we instinctively look and turn our head towards the direction of that stimuli. Would you guys agree with me? So before we even have a conscious decision that we should look to what you're sort of like responding to, your body, your head and eyes have already turned to that area. That's because of a reflex. Just like we do a tendon tap reflex and it moves. If we have a very significant visual stimuli, the superior colliculi activates and moves our head and eyes towards that stimuli. Or if we have a very loud stimuli or a very auditory significant stimuli, the inferior colliculi moves our head and eyes towards that as well. The colliculi are basically the bumps. It's a way to sort of landmark the anatomy. It's basically collections of neurons that are meeting together. So all the neurons from the ears and eyes are going to be meeting in there and then going out to the head muscles and the eye muscles. The medulla, does anyone watch, oh my God, Waterboy? The medulla oblongata. Yeah, this is what the medulla is. So the medulla is a lot of things, but it's the emerging site for a lot of cranial nerves. But it is involved in a lot of those regulatory autonomic functions for homeostasis, respiration, heart rate, reflexes like coughing, vomiting, sneezing. All of that sort of happens through here. See that word, decussation? See how like the axons are crossing over? There's a crossing of our motor neurons in the medulla. It doesn't only happen there, but it does happen a significant amount right here. That happens in the medulla. So those are the three different areas of the brain. Remember, the pons is an emerging site for cranial nerves and is the connection site for the cerebellum. Any questions, guys? Oh, Talasi asks, is there an organizational pathway within the colliculi that tells the neurons where to go next from the meeting point? Yeah, like think of everything in the nervous system as connections. So if this happens, this goes here. If this happens, this goes there. So loud enough stimuli to activate the neurons that go to the colliculi, it relays those to the specific neck and eye muscles. It's just a reflex. Like, it's not conscious, it just happens immediately. So Joseph asking, how is it so complex? Just evolution. It's like it evolved from one signal to another, to a signal that can branch out, and then so many different connections. It's beautiful. But this is all simulation, so maybe it's not even real. One interesting thing about the brain, have you guys ever heard the blood-brain barrier? That's what Westworld was about? Oh, no. Okay, so if you were to look at the blood vessels in the brain, it would look sort of like on this picture on the left. But there's a separation that, like, the circulatory system is separate from the brain. So blood diffuses all of those nutrients into their cerebrospinal fluid that is pumped through the brain. So there's a selective semi-permeable membrane that separates the circulating blood from the extracellular fluid in the central nervous system. So there's certain drugs that cross the blood-brain barrier. That barrier is there so that way the things that we eat that get pumped into our like blood circulation doesn't automatically glow into the brain. The central nervous system, remember, is separate and has its cerebrospinal fluid. This is just a diagram depicting the different areas that we've talked about. And then if you wanted to look at just a sort of overview of what we talked about, the different areas and what they're responsible for, this is just a good flow chart. So you wouldn't be like asked to memorize this. This is just a summary for you of the things we talked about in the lecture. Any questions about any of that anatomy, guys? People, sorry. You do have questions or no? Acceleration. Wait, what are we talking about? Oh, Hannah's asking a question. Can you repeat the pons and midbrain part? The midbrain is, so there's three, so this is for Hannah. Right here. The brainstem is organized into three different areas. The midbrain, which has some colliculi, but it is basically just the stalks that hold the brainstem to the cerebrum. The pons is the middle, and it's connecting to the cerebellum, and the medulla has a lot of the autonomic homeostasis features. Anna. So I'm getting just a bunch of questions. Views of the separate functions. Does that make sense? Yeah, the pons, I mean, we can get into depth. The pons actually has some stuff in it, but it's basically a connection site for the cerebellum, yes. The way that I described it, Hannah, did that make better sense for you? Okay, perfect. Jen's asking a question. Can you clarify the differences between the motor and the sensory homunculus? Okay, so the big one would be that there's a greater representation for the tongue on the sensory homunculus because of our sense of taste. But they do look very similar. Joseph is asking a question. Wait, in the sensory homunculus, was that in the post-central gyrus or the somatosensory region? That's the same thing. Yeah, you can think about it that way. Sean's saying the afferent would be post the central sulcus, and then the efferent would be ahead or anterior to the central sulcus. Yeah, the central sulcus is dividing the motor area versus the sensory area. Cool, right? So if you guys are okay, we can continue on to concussions. We still have some extra time, or we could just keep asking, you guys can keep asking questions and I can help answer. Let's continue. Okay. Okay. So let's finish off with talking about concussions. Concussions are important because we know so much about them now. They're big in research and they're honestly very big in like clinical aspects. So we need to understand concussions, what actually happens, and how it can affect movement, because concussions also affect different areas of the brain. Has anyone had a concussion before? What were some of the symptoms that you had, Hannah? Mason's had 5, so that's terrible. Nausea, memory gaps. Some people have headaches. Some people have problems with movement. Some people have problems with light or sound sensitivity. Yeah. So it affects not just the motor system, but a bunch of different areas. And let's get into why that could be. So concussions are not, before evolutionarily, or not evolutionarily, before, did you guys ever hear the term like coup, consular coup? How they thought that a concussion was as a result of an acceleration causing or a hit causing the brain to rattle around in the skull. That actually doesn't really happen. But what happens is that with an acceleration, we get shearing of the axons. Now, the problem with concussions, or what are also called mild traumatic brain injuries, is that they are frequent. And now we're realizing that they are more common than we thought. And they happen without overt like imaging findings. So if you had a concussion, so Mason had a concussion and someone else didn't have a concussion, you could take an MRI of both individuals and not be able to tell who has a concussion and who doesn't. And that's the problem. So much research is looking into how do you clinically best diagnose a concussion. So first, let's talk about what actually happens. So when we're looking at the anatomy of the brain, imagine the brain, imagine as all of the nerves as wires that are traveling this way. When you have an acceleration, what happens is that the gray matter and the white matter has fat, so it's heavier. They accelerate at different velocities. And so what happens is that you get shearing or pulling of the axons. And when you pull the axon, what happens is that all of the channels that are there that are important to maintain the sodium-potassium pump to create the electrical potentials, what happens is that opening the channels causes ions and metabolites to flow into the nerve and out of the neuron. And so you get a firing of all of the neurons in that area. That deformation causes a huge release of a potential in a large area of the brain. And so what happens with a concussion is that whatever part of the brain was affected, that part of the brain is very, very tired because it's lost so much of its potential or lost so much of its energy. So here we have like sort of a bit of a diagram of what could occur. And what research shows is that if you get a concussion and you let it heal and then get a second concussion, there's no additive effect. So you can get a concussion, let it heal, and then get another one. And research shows that the second concussion, if the first one was healed, doesn't hurt the brain anymore. The problem is when you get a second concussion before the first one hasn't healed. And that's when you get sort of a buildup of all of the proteins and calcium that can lead to more significant degeneration or even death. Because what happens is that it takes so long for the sodium, potassium, or the energy pumps to return energy to that part of the brain that it's if you were to imagine like, so here's our brain energy level and we get a concussion, it's going to take time for the energy to come back. If we get a second concussion, it drops it even further. It's exponential. So they just looked at the different proteins or an energy signature in the brain. And so they did a sort of like, so that was mice studies. They looked at like giving the mice concussion and then taking apart their brains and seeing when the energy levels were back to normal. It took about 30 days. It's time. But if you could determine a way to define if someone or diagnose if someone has a concussion, it would be really helpful, obviously, clinically. And so what research has done is trying to look at protein markers that would indicate, or biomarkers that would indicate that a concussion is occurring. That's what this slide is talking about. Sharon's asked a question: how does one end up with post-concussion syndrome with injuries 10 years apart? So that would mean that technically they never healed from their first one. So there could have been a third one in there or a second one in there they didn't even know about. Yeah. Because nowadays, if you think someone has a concussion, they got a concussion. It's so common. So now in sports, anytime there's a question, they take them back and then wait, right? Concussions are such a huge thing now. Whereas before, if you got your bell wrong, you go back in the game. So Jen's asked a question about post-concussional syndrome. So post-concussional syndrome is any concussion-related symptoms that happen past 30 days. And so what has happened with post-concussional syndrome, you've had 2 concussions or 3 or more concussions in a small area. And so because each successive concussion causes more and more damage that takes longer to heal from, in post-concussional syndrome, whatever, let's see how many concussions that they've had, those symptoms may never go away because it's exponentially affected the brain so much. Does that make sense for everyone? Yay. Okay. So on that note, like how many days does it take to recover from a concussion? That's where they came up with the idea of 30 days. Just research looking at my studies. So clinically, the best thing to do is to ensure that someone doesn't sustain a concussion once they've had the first one. And a big thing with concussion treatments with all the patients that we have, the first day, I do a physical assessment and it's all education. Yeah, so Michaela can complete concussion management. That is my friend that started that. Cam? We went to school together, and then he started that company. It's a training site for clinicians. Have you met Cam? Yeah. That's great. You'll find everyone that it's a small world, right? Like the people that are in our field, you always sort of interact with each other. So don't burn any bridges. You know, it always come back. Yeah, so Matt Sanchez, I used to work with, he has a Locomat machine for spinal cord injuries. So his company, Neurochangers, he started off because he started doing more like neuro rehab. Yeah. There's lots of different, and what was the Will Smith movie? That one's really good too. What's it called? Concussion? Was it? It's a great title name. Awesome. Oh my God, it was. Well, there you go, Sean. So how do you guys feel about the lecture? Yeah, lots. So Matt, and anyone who's taking Cam's course does. Yeah, so Jen's saying she's very interesting, but feeling a little bit overwhelmed. I think the best thing to do is just go through the lecture slides and sort of pick out what is repeated. You try to get like an idea of like sort of the general concepts, and then if anything isn't sticking, then tell me next week. Okay, yeah, you guys want a little bit of history about me? Okay. Here, let me unrecord it. Or I don't know if you guys want to check it on YouTube. Okay, awesome, Fayaz. So I'm just trying to organize it a lot so that way it's very structured. So I feel like that will help rather than it being all over the place. That'll just going to overwhelm you more. I just want to keep things super structured so that way it allows you to take in the material the best that you can, given it's all new. You're blessed. It takes 2 hours for it to process, and then get uploaded to YouTube. It's gotta get processed on this, then I gotta upload it, and then usually it takes about 2 hours. So my background, I actually went to vet school for a year, and then I switched over to human. So I did human kinetics, which is KINE at Guelph. Then I did a master's in biomechanics. I started a PhD in neuroscience because part of my master's research was looking at like EMG or muscle activation. I got into chiro school. In my lab, there was the chiro for Team Canada soccer. So when I was doing the review process for my master's studies, they kept asking clinical questions that I didn't know, and she really helped. And then I didn't know what I wanted to do. I knew I was maybe going to finish a PhD and then continue on, just like all of us. We kind of want to do anything and everything. So I applied. I thought it was super interesting. I applied and got in, and then went that path. Once I graduated, I knew that I still wanted to continue on in research. So I came to Ontario Tech, was UOT at the time, and I let them know of my intent. And so I started being a prof with the intent in finishing my research there. And then I worked at the clinic there. Health center. Can you look at the brain plastic the inner walls? Is CRT. So Fayaz said something about something. Oh, so that's the contra coup thing. Before they used to think that concussions were as a result of the brain rattling and hitting the sides of the skull and then causing bruising. But now they've realized that that's not what happens. Yeah, so I just, unfortunately, your boxing coach isn't wrong. He just is aware of what was thought when he learned that. So you can let him know about what we've learned. So Joseph is asking how a punch could cause shearing, because it's anything that causes an acceleration. So if you get hit in the head with a punch, your head's going to move, and then the insides are going to accelerate. Do you understand that, Joseph? Yeah, because I don't know if there's anything. Oh, did he say anything? That one? Perfect. Sorry, I lost it. Yeah, exactly like that, William. Perfect. So, not to stress you guys out, but remember, so we'll have next lecture, and then after that, we'll have the midterm. So the midterm will be on 3 lectures, then we'll have another 3 lectures and a midterm. Next week, I'm going to post the breakdown of the midterm for 2 weeks or whenever it is. It's listed on the syllabus. And then come into lecture next week just with questions, so that way you guys get the material. I hope you all really enjoyed this week. It was really nice talking to all of you. Very engaging. Lots of jokes. The tutorial, I think, is the second. Carson, check the syllabus. The midterm will be online, yes, Jasmine. There's no lecture in person. So the group chat in the courses, so if you look on the modules, Talassi, I put like there's like a link for basically a group chat, like a messaging board. Yeah, I think that would be correct. Shane just checked the syllabus. Awesome. Okay, bye everyone. I actually have a concussion patient right now. Okay, bye-bye. Email me if there's anything.